Today we're going to focus on lipids and proteins in our discussion of the different macromolecules of life. So just a reminder, yesterday in the previous video we talked about carbohydrates. So let's focus on lipids. So what all lipids have in common, think of lipids, it's not exactly just a fancy word for fat, but lipids, the main thing that we usually talk about with lipids are fats. So think of lipids as sort of fats. The main thing all lipids have in common is that they don't dissolve in water. And the reason they don't dissolve in water is because they are non-polar. If you remember when we talked about water in our last chapter, we talked about water being polar. It had this uneven sharing of electrons. It turns out lipids are very non-polar. The electrons are shared very evenly, and things that are non-polar are kind of repelled by things that are polar. So what does your body use lipids for? A couple of things. The main one, that most obvious one most people know, is that lipids store energy. They have about 9 calories per gram, whereas proteins and carbohydrates only have about 4 calories per gram. So they have a lot more calories in them, and that's actually a good thing because that's a way of storing energy in your body in a really compact way. A particular type of lipid we're going to speak about very briefly is part of our cell membrane. They also can form waterproof coverings on things. For example, waxes are lipids that coat plant leaves and make them waterproof. And steroids, believe it or not, also fall into the group of lipids. Now, the building blocks of lipids, it says here, are fatty acids. Technically, steroids are not made out of fatty acids, but the other lipids are made out of these long chains called fatty acids, which I'm going to show you in a second. And examples of lipids include fats, oils, and waxes. Again, all things that don't like water, hydrophobic. So what's the difference between a saturated fat and an unsaturated fat? Well, saturated fats, you can recognize them because they're solid at room temperature. So for example, butter is a saturated fat. Bacon grease is a saturated fat. The marbling on a steak is saturated fat. Unsaturated fats are typically liquids at room temperature, so like corn oil, olive oil, sunflower seed oil. So this is a way that you could visually recognize them. Now, what makes them saturated versus unsaturated? Well, here's a picture. These are 2 fatty acids. So notice how they're long chains of just carbon and hydrogen. So what's the difference between them? Well, if you look closely, you see how this one has these little equal signs here. So these little equal signs are actually double bonds. So what's a double bond? I said this in class and I didn't even think about the fact that somebody asked me, what does that mean? What is a double bond? So every time you see a bond, it means that these 2 carbons, for example, are sharing 1 pair of electrons. In a double bond, they're actually sharing 2 pairs of electrons. Now you might say, okay, so what? How does that affect them? Well, it turns out that these double bonds cause this fatty acid to sort of bend or fold into a particular shape that makes it a liquid at room temperature. Whereas this one, you see the one on top, the saturated one, how all the bonds between the carbons are single bonds. It turns out that in nature, those single bonds make this structure sort of very straight. And it makes it really easy for them to sort of solidify very easily. Whereas with the double bonds, even though they don't really show it here, the double bonds, everywhere there's a double bond, it sort of causes it to bend in different directions. So it looks something like this instead of being straight, every time there's a double bond. And that makes it less likely to sort of stack together and solidify. Okay, so here's a little summary.
Lipids, if you remember, are one of our organic compounds that have a large proportion of carbon-hydrogen bonds and less oxygen than the carbohydrates that we just described. Lipids, one of their main properties is that they're insoluble in water. And so examples of lipids include fats, oils, and waxes. So cells use these lipids for energy storage, insulation, but they're also incredibly crucial components of the cell membrane, which control what enter and leave cells.
All right, so that's just a little summary there. All right, other lipids besides just fats and oils and waxes, phospholipids are actually the name of the ones that are in cell membranes. They look a little bit different. I'll show you a picture on the next slide. And then steroids, we always think of steroids as a bad thing, like, oh, anabolic steroids, that's like what muscle, bodybuilders use and they're illegal. But technically, cholesterol is actually a steroid. And some of the hormones in your body, like estrogen and testosterone, those are actually steroid hormones, which are actually made from cholesterol. You actually make cholesterol in your liver. And then also, when you eat cholesterol, that cholesterol can be processed into certain hormones and things that you need. Cholesterol also is part of your cell membranes. We're going to learn more about that in our next chapter on cells, but it actually helps to keep your cell membrane fluid and functioning properly. So steroids are not necessarily a bad thing. This is a picture of a phospholipid. It always looks like kind of like this ball with these two little sticks coming off of it. And we're going to talk about phospholipids way more in our next chapter. But the interesting thing about them is that because of this phospho part at the end, it has a phosphate. This part likes water, and then the lipid part doesn't. So phospholipids behave kind of in an interesting way. Instead of just totally hating water like all the other lipids, they have like a little section that likes water and then a section that doesn't. And this is what a steroid looks like. They are always made out of, they look like these rings fused together. Technically, all these spots in the ring, we're not going to get into it, but you may talk more about this in chemistry, are where carbons are. It's sort of a way of writing things in chemistry. They don't always write out all the letter C's for the carbons. But always steroids have this kind of interesting structure where it's these rings that are sort of fused together. And this would include, again, testosterone, estrogen, things like that. All right, our last section for today is proteins. So proteins, their building blocks are called amino acids. And there's actually 20 different main amino acids that your body uses. You may have heard of somebody taking amino acid supplements. But what amino acids do is they get hooked together into these really long chains. And each amino acid has different properties. So depending on how long the chain is and which amino acids are in the chain, that's going to give the protein its particular function. And proteins are probably the most important of all the things we talk about as far as what really composes your body and gives you your physical characteristics and regulates reactions in your body. So, for example, enzymes, which we're going to talk about tomorrow, are an example of proteins. They speed up reactions in your body. Transport is carried out by proteins, carrying things through the body, like hemoglobin in your blood carries oxygen. Cell processes involve proteins. Antibodies are made out of proteins, so you fight diseases with proteins. And structures, like your hair, your fingernails, that's keratin, collagen that makes your skin flexible, melanin that gives your skin and your eyes and your hair the pigment, the coloration that it has. All of that is made out of protein. So they are very important. This is the building block on a molecular level. This is called an amino acid. It has this nitrogen group on one end called an amino group. It has this other group called a carboxyl group on the other end. And then a carbon in the middle. And then see this letter R. So this is sort of like how in algebra you can use X to mean like a variable. You know, you solve for X and depending on the equation, X is something different. Remember how on the previous slide I said there were 20 different amino acids? There's 20 different R groups. And so depending on what is in this spot where they're just using the letter R, that's going to determine what specific amino acid something is. When they hook together, there's a little reaction that happens, and this is the first amino acid, this is the second one, and now they're hooked together, and they'll basically hook together into this really long chain that might be 200 or even up to 1,000 amino acids long, and then that'll fold into a shape that's going to be the ultimate protein that does some job.
Each protein has a unique primary structure, a particular number and sequence of amino acids making up the polypeptide chain. 20 different amino acids are used to build proteins. Theoretically, the various amino acids could be linked in almost any sequence, forming an almost infinite variety of different proteins. This illustration shows some of the amino acids making up the primary structure of a protein. The structure of a single generalized amino acid is shown below. The main backbone of every amino acid is the same. This is what forms the backbone of the polypeptide chain. It is the R group, which projects out from the backbone, that makes each of the 20 kinds of amino acids unique. Different amino acids have different properties that affect the folding of a protein. Thus, primary structure ultimately determines the shape of a protein, which determines its function.
All right, and so that's amino acids and proteins. And actually, that's where we're going to stop for today. Tomorrow, we're going to focus on a specific kind of protein called enzymes that do really important jobs in your body.